Welcome to our Simon Alumni webinar with Cliff Smith, the Louise and Henry Epstein Emeritus Professor and Emeritus Professor of Finance and Economics. I'm Sevin Yeltekin, Dean of the Simon Business School, and I have a very easy job, which is to introduce one of our most beloved faculty members who certainly doesn't need an introduction. For over 45 years, Cliff was on the front lines working to forever change the world of corporate finance and the Simon Business School. He's celebrated for his research and was recognized so many times for his teaching excellence that we renamed the Executive MBA Superior Teaching Award in his honor. Cliff, the overwhelming popularity of this session, I think this is our third time at least together, continues to amaze me each year. Today we've had well over 600 alumni registered to hear your top 10 concerns for 2024. And I'm eager to hear from him. I'm sure you all are eager to hear from him. So it's my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Cliff. So take it away.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate the kind introduction, and certainly thank you for showing up to listen in to whatever I come up with today. I'm struggling with something that's a problem that's sort of like Business Week had. When you commit to doing things on a regular basis, you know, Business Week would virtually always have Chicago, Harvard, Wharton, Stanford in their top 10 schools. There's going to be some overlap between things that I was concerned about last year and things that I'm still concerned about this year. I appreciate your forbearance. Before I get too far, there's one other thing that I probably should say, and that is I've received a tremendous amount of help and certainly technical support from my daughters, Morgan and Taylor. They both have degrees from Simon. They've been incredibly helpful. I couldn't do this without them. Thank you. Number 10, the estate tax law is something that I've been concerned about. There's a sunset provision in the current law. Right now, the exclusion amount to avoid the estate tax is something above $13 million, and that's almost $27 million for a married couple. But that law has a sunset provision. So at the end of 2025, the current rules change. It reverts back to previous circumstances. And best guess is now is the exclusion amount would be closer to $7 million. If you're lucky enough to be in a set of circumstances, or your family's in a set of circumstances where this reduction in exclusion amount would make this more onerous, my suggestion is that you talk to your tax lawyer, your accountant, sooner rather than later. The earlier you start this process, the easier and the more effective the wealth transfer that you can have between generations in your family, the more effective that might be. Number 9, climate change. Now, I will admit that different people look at this climate change issue in different ways. Given the snowstorm that just hit upstate New York, there are some people that say global warming doesn't sound like such a bad idea. On the other hand, if you live in South Florida, you might say, oh my God, hurricanes are going to be more frequent and more onerous. This is something that's clearly a concern. If you've looked at the recent climate conference in Dubai, you have to be struck by a couple of things. One is that the major countries are primarily concerned with other countries shouldering their fair share. On the other hand, if you look at some of the smaller countries, especially some of the island nations, they are extremely concerned about the potential for sea level rise. And instead of suggesting that they pay, they're suggesting that they receive payments from other larger countries that are undoubtedly a bigger contributor to this potential problem. There are a couple of things that came up in that conference that I find a little beside the point. There were people that would stand up and say, we need to have a sunset on the use of petrochemicals. These greenhouse gases are heating up the entire globe, and that's causing major problems. That's ultimately a silly goal to articulate. I mean, look, there are going to be some places where switching from petrochemicals to other kinds of energy sources are going to be relatively straightforward. You have to compliment the U.S. Navy for taking some of their bigger ships, and instead of being run by diesel fuel, they're run with a nuclear reactor. On the other hand, you can't put a nuclear reactor in an airplane that could clear the end of the runway. And so I just don't understand any technology that's on the horizon that would allow international air travel and reduce the use of or eliminate the use of petrochemicals. So what we want to do is go to the right margin. Let's go on to one thing that is clearly a divisive issue within the country is abortion. There are people that feel extremely passionate on both sides of this issue. There are states that have put dramatic, onerous restrictions on access to this particular medical procedure. And there are other states that have enshrined that access in their state constitutions. I worry that this is an issue that's going to be difficult to resolve through legislation. Look, the U.S. is generally a lawful nation, and I think that a big part of the fact that people obey the laws is that the overwhelming majority of laws are supported by the overwhelming majority of people, that they voluntarily adhere to the law. If you start passing laws where there's a substantial number of people, and some measures the majority of people are opposed to the law, you're going to have people in the economy sitting back saying, well, this law I agree with and that law I don't. So I'll obey this law and I won't obey that one. We simply do not have enough police to force people to obey all the laws. This puts an important constraint on responsive legislation, that they only pass laws that are agreed with by the majority of people. I just think throwing this into the political arena and thinking that state legislatures are going to solve this problem, I don't think that that's a good solution to the challenges that we face. United States politics, this is a mess. Congress, for example, I see more and more aggressive use of log rolling in Congress, which is basically a political version of tie-in sales. And let me say before I get too far down this, I happen to believe that a lot of what gets passed, for example, in the US Congress, amounts to investing in negative net present value projects. And so in that sense, having a logjam in Congress isn't obviously a bad thing. But this log rolling problem creates some issues that I don't exactly know how to deal with. Because what winds up happening is some senator or representative will stand up and say, I'm not going to allow military promotions to go through, or I'm not going to allow aid to the Ukraine to go through unless I get this concession on the other side. So they highlight not the least valuable pieces of legislation and throw them away. They highlight things that are arguably some of the most valuable things and try and hold them hostage to getting a result that is closer to what they would like. Presidential politics, we've got an election that's coming up in a couple of years. And, when I look at President Biden, he is currently the oldest sitting president. And he's suggested he's going to run for re-election. You add 6 years to his current age, and given that I am now one of the elderly in this country, you lose a step. I can't do things today that I could do when I was in my 50s. I have big concerns about exactly what his capabilities are going to be as additional time passes. I would hope that the Democrats wake up and recognize this problem. Which brings us to former President Trump. Now, reasonable people might disagree on this, but as far as I can see, what happened on January 6th is something that should disqualify him from future office. I also think that he's one of the most divisive politicians that we've seen in decades. And if you think about political economy, to win elections, you have to capture the median voter. The more extreme things that he says and does, the more you lose the middle. So I would hope that even if he were the Republican nominee, that he'd stand little or no chance of winning that election. Ultimately, I think we need alternative candidates for political office. This country deserves better. An issue that keeps coming up in the business press has to do with artificial intelligence. Now, on the one hand, this is technology that brings an incredibly broad array of information to bear on a particular question. And that's a wonderful thing. It's got to increase productivity. But there's some issues that it raises. Some of the artificial intelligence technology seems to go out and grab anything that's been published. Now, we've had copyright laws in this country for a long, long time. As someone that's written books and articles, turning all of those things into public goods has some negative consequences. It certainly undercuts people's incentive to go out and invest in new information. When I think about where this all shakes out, I sort of go to two extremes. One, if I'm putting together an internal memo for my employer, I don't see that there's a huge problem with using artificial intelligence. Heck, I've seen memos at most big companies that amount to cut and paste jobs. On the other hand, if there's something that's going to be distributed more broadly, it's going to be published, it's going to be put more in the public domain, then you've got to worry what in the academic community would be referred to as plagiarism. And so in that case, I don't really have a problem with using artificial intelligence programs as a way of coming up with the first draft of something that's going to be distributed more broadly. But in that case, you need to be very careful that your process of editing and rewriting and reorganizing is something that stays inside the lines. Ultimately, I think we need clearer, more effective guardrails on where artificial intelligence is appropriate to be used. Immigration. This is a mess. If I look at some of the things that's happened, especially along the Texas-Mexico border, Governor Abbott in Texas tried to put constraints on what could be done with respect to immigration. Now, the courts have ruled that the Constitution grants the exclusive right to manage immigration to the federal government. But that raises another set of issues. If I go back to the Federalist Papers, those documents that were pamphlets put together trying to get states to adopt the revised U.S. Constitution, one of the provisions in it said that national defense is something that is an issue that's the responsibility of the federal government. You can imagine that if we decentralized the decision on national defense to states, that Wyoming or Nebraska would be states that would have very little in their state budget for national defense. You got to go through a lot of states to get to either one of those states. It's not a big problem for them. Let those guys that are closer to the coast or the border manage the problems. One of the things that when we start talking about internal organization of companies, we say is you want to co-locate the decision rights with the responsibility associated with exercising those decision rights. So federal decisions that ultimately impose costs on individual states create conflicts and problems. I find it interesting that one of the things that Governor Abbott has done is put a busload of immigrants and send them to New York City or Los Angeles or Martha's Vineyard and say, you guys have argued that there ought to be fewer restraints on immigration. You deal with some of these costs. And unsurprisingly, those cities have uniformly appealed to Washington for additional funds to help deal with this influx of immigrants. If it works for companies, I think it ought to work for the government. If we're going to have these decisions left to the federal government, some of the implications of those decisions they need to take responsibility for as well. My last four are going to have some similarity in their overall theme, and that is we've got to worry about international conflicts. North Korea, in the last couple of weeks, set off a missile that arguably could reach any place in the U.S., whether we're talking about Rochester, New York, or Tampa, Florida. That technology is increased in such a way that they can reach any of us. When you look at the GDP per capita of South Korea versus North Korea, I can only conclude that the leadership in North Korea is less concerned about the welfare of the typical citizen than the rest of the world is. And that suggests to me that the leadership in North Korea is more narrowly focused on their own objectives. And I worry that an unstable leader can ignite broader conflicts. China, in the most recent New Year's address to the country, the president of China asserted that Taiwan and mainland China were going to be reunified. Now, the U.S. has mutual defense agreements with Taiwan. Again, I worry that that kind of action is something that can create a broader set of conflicts. When Hong Kong was about to be returned under the use contract that had originally been negotiated 100 years ago, returned to China, China said, "Oh, don't worry, we're not going to make big changes." And that's turned out to be an inaccurate characterization of what's going on. I have a hard time imagining China's going to be able to credibly argue with Taiwan that they should peacefully rejoin mainland China in the overall political sphere. Any of these things, again, can ignite broader conflicts. It can spill over. Number two, the Ukraine versus Russia. People generally point back to the invasion 2 years ago by Russia of Ukraine. But in fact, I think the starting date needs to be backed up, that in 2014, Russia came in and basically seized Crimea. I think the Ukrainians deserve a tremendous amount of credit for mounting a heroic rebuff of this Russian aggression, transgression. And this is another one of these cases where I worry that there are broader issues at stake. It's been over a decade that the Ukraine applied to the European Union for admission. And one of the problems is that that's been rebuffed by some of the countries. Hungary comes to mind. When the European Union started, there were 6 Western European countries that started the whole thing: France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium. That's a dramatically more homogeneous group of countries than what we have when we start adding in Greece and Spain and Portugal and Turkey and Hungary and some of the Balkans. Their original charter said that for big decisions that there had to be unanimity among the various participants. And what that does is it basically gives veto power to any of the countries. Most recently, we've seen Turkey stop any move to include Sweden in the European Union. I just think that with the expansion of the size of the EU and the inclusion of more disparate voices in that union, that changing this requirement for unanimity, something that gives every country in the union veto power over major decisions, that needs to be modified. Finally, my biggest concern has to do with this conflict between Israel and Hamas. Now, ultimately, the problems between the Jews and the Palestinians goes back to the end of World War II, when Israel was carved out of the Middle East. But a few months ago, when Hamas put together this invasion, it's created a dramatically more difficult set of circumstances in that part of the world. Hostages were taken, people were killed. Israel responded by going into Gaza, and again, more lives were lost. A tremendous amount of physical capital was just destroyed. More recently, there have been drone attacks on senior leadership among Hamas. Israel has articulated that they want to destroy Hamas, and they'll go outside of Gaza to do it. This has led to a broadening of the overall sphere of conflict. Hamas has stated that their objective is to eliminate Jews. This just strikes me as one of those conflicts that is closer and closer and closer to igniting a dramatically broader conflict. When I look at what started World War One, basically it was Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was assassinated. That was the match that started this whole thing that ended in the First World War. When I was in high school, I was in the Boy Scouts. I learned how to start a campfire with flint and steel. You strike the two together, you create a spark that if you put it in shredded bark, it can turn into an ember that if you blow on it and add twigs and then limbs and then tree trunks, you can produce a roaring campfire. I worry that any of these four things that I just talked about could be the spark that starts World War III, and that is with the current technology, the current bombs, the current ways that people can kill each other on this planet. That's just a fundamentally terrifying thought. It puts a brick in my shorts. And other than more direct ways of trying to get to both sides, to get them to back off, to be more reasonable in their goals and how they might be achieved, I'm just having a hard time figuring out exactly how this is going to be resolved. Earlier on, there was a proposal for a two-state solution, Palestine and Israel living side by side. That seems less likely today than it was 6 months ago. As I say, when I have concerns, this one has floated to the top of my list. Well, I hope I've said something today that has sparked some thought on the part of the array of people that have flattered me by tuning in. So thank you.
Thank you, Cliff, for once again touching on a variety of economic and this time, of course, even probably a longer list of political risks and issues. And you've given us a lot of food for thought. During this registration event, we did ask our registrants to submit some questions that we can start the Q&A with. And so we have a few themes that emerge from those submissions that I thought we could start off the Q&A with, and then we'll go to the questions that are being submitted on the spot through the Q&A function. So those of you listening, if you have any questions for Cliff, please do submit it into the Q&A function. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible during the time that we have left. So maybe we take this in kind of in reverse order. It's certainly sobering, and it's very much on the top of our minds. Everybody, who's watching the news, whether it's the election, whether it's the sort of the international global conflicts or relationships. But maybe we go back to kind of the economics of it all and go back to the beginning. And let's talk about some of the things that have been hitting the wire, maybe in the United States. Let's talk about US national debt. There's been now an agreement to move the debt ceiling. And where do you see that going? What do you think might be the impact over the 5 years? Is the debt, it didn't make it onto your list. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's keeping you up at night, but is, you know, if the list was 20 or 30, would national debt be somewhere that you would be worried about?
Oh, I'm sure it would. You know, one of the first uh, economists to try and get their arms around this issue was David Ricardo, and basically came out with something that if you spend as much time worrying about corporate finance as I have, you might refer to as the Modigliani-Miller theorem applied to public finance as opposed to corporate finance. Basically, what he said was, you know, if you take the whole sequence of potential current and future government spending as given, that how you finance this is something that is not important, that the present value of the taxes necessary to pay for those expenditures is what you need to focus on. And there's a point to be made there, but just like with Modigliani and Miller, taking that idea and turning it on its head, saying, well, what is it that they're assuming away that perhaps they shouldn't, is where I want to go to next. And that is, if you if the government of the US at least seems completely unconcerned about borrowing today and having to pay for it in the future, because that's a different Congress that's going to be in place. I if I turn the clock back 25 years, politicians seem more concerned about the national debt than they do today. One of the issues has to do with the fact that there's the monetization of the debt, that one of the biggest purchasers of the debt is the Federal Reserve. And what that basically does is transform deficits and debt into increases in the money supply. I was listening to NPR a week or two ago, and they had an economist on. Can't remember her name, but she was the major economic advisor to who was the third party candidate? Barney, Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders, yeah.
And she just flatly said that borrowing doesn't matter at all. And I think that that's a statement too extreme, because when you start monetizing this debt, you start increasing inflation, and that causes problems. Even if you don't monetize it, there in capital markets going to be trade-offs between public debt and corporate debt, or individuals borrowing, and there's this potential for crowding out that goes on there. And trying to balance all those issues is difficult. I certainly don't have a magic wand that I can wave over that problem and make it all go away.
No.
But it's clearly a problem. How it's managed is going to be an issue that can either create monumental problems or make the transition from where we are today to where we're going to be a decade or two from now easier or more challenging.
Well, thank you for that. And now that you've touched on a little bit on the Federal Reserve and cost of borrowing and inflationary possible pressures that come from monetization of debt, a question that came up not just in the pre-submits, but also I think is again top of mind for many folks, and is coming up now on the Q&A as well. Let's talk a little bit about U.S. interest rates and inflation. We've gone through this sort of interest rate hikes to try to tame inflation. By all accounts, it looks like the Federal Reserve is about to maybe, declare victory very soon for soft landing the economy. What's your view on what's happening? I mean, the U.S. economy has kind of outperformed expectations, and we would love to hear your view on that.
When I think about interest rates, what's going to get reported in the Wall Street Journal is going to be nominal interest rates. Mm-hmm. And there's nobody that's been through the Simon School that wouldn't understand that those nominal interest rates can be decomposed into a real rate and expected rates of inflation. When I look historically at the volatility of nominal interest rates, it seems much more affected by volatility in expected rates of inflation than by volatility in real rates. Now, when I look at the discussions that show up in the New York Times for control of inflation and the role that the Federal Reserve plays in this process, they invariably say, well, the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. The only interest rate that the Federal Reserve directly controls is the discount rate at the discount window. And that's kind of a funny rate. Mm-hmm. I mean, first, it's a very small part of the overall credit market in the country. But second, it's not what you might call a clean rate. I mean, if JP Morgan looked at the current discount rate and said, that's cheaper than I could borrow other places in capital markets, I think what I'll do is I'll go to the discount window and take out a couple of $1 trillion. The problem that you run into is that the Federal Reserve would say, why are you doing this? The only people that are supposed to be using this discount window are financially distressed financial institutions. What kind of problems do you have that we don't know about? And the next thing you know is they're going to have examiners from the Federal Reserve showing up every week and creating all kinds of mischief, having senior leadership in the bank on the phone, visiting Washington interminably, asking, well, what are you doing? Why are you using it? In other words, there are two costs associated with using the discount window. There's the explicit direct cost, you got to pay us this much interest. But there's this somewhat more subtle cost associated with political harassment on the part of senior leadership. And so we're not exactly seeing a clean interest rate when we focus on this discount rate. I think that what's happened is more the increases in the growth in the money supply has increased people's expectations about inflation, and that a lot of the change in nominal interest rates is should be focused more on the rate of change in the money supply rather than what's happening at the discount window of the Federal Reserve. So I mean, again, I wish I had a crystal ball or a magic wand or a silver bullet that I could throw at this one. It's one of those really difficult problems. But I would be more comfortable if some of the discussion shifted a little bit away from, well, the Federal Reserve's raised interest rates, because 99% of interest rates in this country don't have anything to do with what the Federal Reserve can directly control.
Okay. What about inflation? We were talking about it right before the webinar started. Certainly, it's a big deal, especially for folks close to retirement or who have already retired, since they tend to have a bigger piece of the nominal assets as in their portfolio. That's one of the questions that came up through the pre-submitted ones as well. So what advice, if any, could we give to them in terms of minimizing their financial risk?
Well, there are a couple of issues that your question or their questions raise. One is how's inflation measured? And one of the things that happens is when you've got important parts of the economy where the quality of the underlying goods and services that are being provided are changing, the typical ways, the traditional ways of measuring inflation just don't capture those things very well at all. I was looking at a rerun of an old TV show. Someone ran out to their car to grab their cell phone. It was the size of a brick. And all you could do on that cell phone was make calls and receive calls. You know, today in my hip pocket, I've got a cell phone that's got probably more computing capacity than the entire university had when I was an undergraduate. The technology's just moved in ways that from a decade or two ago are almost unimaginable. So one of the issues that makes this difficult is because quality is something that's not accounted for in very effective ways in the way these things are measured. I'm afraid some of the reports on what the rate of inflation is are misstated. The remind me again.
Financial risk piece with respect to sort of portfolio of holding nominal assets.
Yeah. You know, if you go to financial planners, one of the first things they're going to do is to say, oh, Cliff Smith, you're 77 years old. This is the portfolio that you should have at your age. You ought to have at least half your money in fixed income. And if I look at my portfolio, the amount that I have in fixed income is zero. Look, I was presented with a set of opportunities working at the Simon School. I've been just phenomenally lucky or good or something. There's no way in hell I'm going to spend whatever I've accumulated between now and the funeral. And so I'm not investing for me. I'm investing for my kids or my grandkids. So I try and invest like a 5-year-old, not a 70-something person. The fixed income that I have in my portfolio is all on the liability side of my balance sheet. A mortgage on the house. So I worry that some of the discussions about inflation, especially how it impacts people in my age group, misses the boat for at least some people in this age category. Clearly, if you're sitting there trying to survive on Social Security and nothing else, you don't have any other accumulated savings, any other wealth to draw back on, this is something that you're going to have to look at in a much more careful way. But I would also point out that even though the adjustment's not perfect, Social Security, in fact, is adjusted for inflation annually. So it's a problem. The balance here is trying to not understate the problem, but not overstate the problem either.
Yeah, maybe we're getting too much of a cautious advice and not the right advice in terms of our time horizon from.
Well, I would hope that for a substantial number of Simon School alums, that their ability to be productive in the economy, to get rewarded for that productivity, and for putting some of that aside, there's an accumulated wealth position, so they're not trying to subsist on just Social Security. I guess one other thing that I'd throw into this discussion is that when people make up balance sheets, they don't always recognize that they're sitting on a pile of durable goods.
Mhm.
Housing is usually included, but I've seen lots of balance sheets that don't have any things about cars and washers and dryers and
Mhm.
refrigerators, things that are not going to just be obsolete next week. It's not like a ham sandwich. And so, so again, it's important to try and strike some reasonable balance, not overstating the problem any more than you'd understate it.
So let's go back in the last sort of couple of minutes that we have. Not that this is enough time to tackle any of the issues that you've raised. Certainly, we talked about the geopolitics of it. I mean, there's a, taking again kind of like an economist view to this and thinking about, let's take, for example, China. We've heard a lot about decoupling of, the trade relationships and being able to kind of break that interdependence that we have. I mean, all of these conflicts, in addition to, of course, the incredibly, the human toll that it has, and the reallocation of resources. In terms of sort of economic impact, let's start with China, for example. What do we think about? How do you think about kind of, this long trade development and interdependence in the supply chain and so on, and how does that square away with the kind of the geopolitical risk and decoupling that we're seeing in the front lines of the news?
Uh, I have a hard time from where I am now understanding exactly how robust the Chinese economy is, because the government is such a large part of their overall economy. And when the government spends $1 million on something, it goes into the overall GNP accounts as being worth $1 million. They can spend $20 million putting up an apartment building in one city in China, and that apartment building might be sitting there completely empty. And yet it gets valued at $20 million in the GNP accounts. That's not the most transparent economy in the world. And so how robust that economy is something that's difficult for me to get completely comfortable with. Now, that being said, there are things that China has done in terms of producing technology, implementing technology. The technology may have been invented someplace else, but in terms of taking that technology and turning it into goods that consumers and businesses can use, is nothing short of stunning. And they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for doing that. But again, it's let's try not to overstate how much progress they've made. Let's don't understate it either.
Yeah, definitely a remarkable, 4 or 5 decades of growth, and we'll see where that goes as well. Well, I know we're close to the hour, and maybe the last question can be back to technology since we've talked about it. You've talked about kind of AI. Do you see one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A is really maybe about kind of adaptation and the use of as a productivity tool of AI for enterprises, large enterprises versus small businesses, and think about small businesses or at least kind of growing businesses as being the bastion of innovation and future growth. Do you see different impact? Do you see them being disadvantaged in this sort of implementation of AI? Is it going to help
I
the
don't know which way that's going to cut. Uh, you know, one of the things that AI is very good at is bringing information from a broad array of sources together in trying to address whatever question has been plugged into the intelligence system, the computer system. And in a sense, that may end up leveling the playing field that large firms historically have been able to invest large resources in very specialized kind of R&D activities, and with creative uses of AI, it may be the case that small businesses can access an array of input that allows them to compete on a more direct toe-to-toe basis with what could only be done by very large, very well-capitalized firms in the past.
Yeah.
So I mean, certainly large companies can use AI as well, but it's not clear to me that they're going to get as big a bump in terms of productivity as maybe some of the smaller businesses would.
Yeah, and maybe the implementation costs or switch costs are smaller for the smaller firms who are a little bit more agile as well. Well, Cliff, thank you very much for yet another annual, get together where we heard about your concerns. And, thank you for an incredible presentation and conversation. Many thanks to our alumni joining from various different places today. We will be featuring Cliff's top 10 concerns for 2024 on the Dean's Corner blog, and it will also be available on our Simon YouTube page. So, you can certainly refer to it and see the recording again. And we want to thank everybody for your time today and wish you a healthy, happy, peaceful, productive 2024. And thank you to Cliff's daughter, Morgan and Taylor, for being big supports and tech support today, especially. So thank you.
Thank you.